Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just mass and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the graphic novel apostle.
Hello, and welcome back to the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. My name is Mark Ohrenberger. I'm your host, as always, for this podcast. This is another one of our in-between weeks, and so we've got a mini episode. As I've done a couple of times in the past with our mini episodes, I want to focus on a couple of books from my pull list that I think are worth highlighting. And today, we're going to go exclusively with two books from Mad Cave Studios. And I'll tell you, Mad Cave Studios is not a publisher that I have a ton of experience reading, but some of their recent offerings have really gotten me interested in exploring probably even more of their back catalog. The two books we'll talk about today are Dick Tracy, who certainly is a character that will be familiar to a lot of you already, and then a book called Sanction as well, and I'll describe them both in just a few minutes. But first I wanted to talk a little bit about a good place to encounter a lot of books from Mad Cave Studios. I've said before here on the podcast that I enjoy to read traditional paper comics, and I'm also perfectly happy to read digital comics. Comic books look beautiful on an iPad. And sometime last year, I discovered an online service called Global Comics. That's Global Comics with an X, one word. They have a subscription service for about $80 a year called their Gold service. You can access and read as many comics as you want, as many times as you want from what they've got in their catalog. And what is in their catalog depends entirely on what publishers choose to upload. Now, they have an option where you can either order a print comic or even buy your own, permanent copy for you to keep, digital copy of the comic. But I tend to look at it like a lot of subscription services where I'm happy to just view the media that I want to see and then move on. I've been really excited about Global Comics over the last year because they've made some big additions with Image Comics adding a bunch of their back catalog, Boom Studios adding a bunch of their back catalog, and then publishers like Mad Cave not only adding a lot of their back catalog, but a lot of their current issues as well. Now, back in episode 1A from middle of May of this year, I talked about a book called Mugshots, and I had forgotten until I started preparing for this episode that was also from Mad Cave. And so I've had a bunch of books that have popped up on my pull list lately that publisher has put out, and I've been really happy to check out. So let me start with Dick Tracy. Let me give you a quick rundown of the credits for the current Dick Tracy title that's running over there at Mad Cave. You have two writers who are working on the series, Alex Segura and Michael Moreci. The series artist is Geraldo Borges. Colors are done by Mark Englert, and letters by Jim Campbell. I'll also point out as well that longtime comic artist Dan Panosian is doing some of the covers. He does a beautiful cover for this and a really exceptional main cover for Sanction number 1, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. I want to talk first about my own history with Dick Tracy. I was 9 years old in 1990 when the Warren Beatty Madonna Dick Tracy movie came out, and that movie is, I feel like, largely forgotten in the culture. It is one that, if you told me I could only have 10 movies from my whole lifetime that I could ever watch again, I would have to have that one on the list. That movie just lit up my imagination when I was a kid, and really still to this day I sit and think about it. Let me run down some of the cast from that movie, and it's remarkable that we're not talking about it all the time today. So in that movie, you had Warren Beatty, Madonna, Al Pacino, William Forsythe, Charles Durning, Mandy Patinkin, Paul Sorvino, Dustin Hoffman, Kathy Bates, Dick Van Dyke, Catherine O'Hara, and James Caan. Holy cow. By the way, if you're playing that, 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, this is probably a good one to keep in your pocket because it's got so many big stars in it all at once. But of course, at 9 years old, that really didn't mean as much to me. Dick Van Dyke, I guess I knew from Mary Poppins, but the rest, maybe not so much. But for me, what it was how colorful the movie was. these villains that you get in Dick Tracy's Rogues Gallery, people talk all the time about Batman's Rogues Gallery as being the most creative and the most interesting one. A lot of people want to make an argument that Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery, some of his villains are just more interesting, or there's enough of them that are so interesting. Give me Dick Tracy's Rogues Gallery over Spider-Man's any day of the week. I will take it. But then with that movie as well, it's set in the 1940s, as I guess Dick Tracy lore just generally is. And I didn't have a whole lot of background in reading the weekly comics in the Sunday newspaper with Dick Tracy. I was aware of it and familiar with it, but it was really that movie that brought it to life for me. But you had the cars from that era, the costumes that were so well done, the music from that sort of big band style that plays all throughout it. I just loved that movie. And so when I saw that there was going to be a new Dick Tracy comic book that was coming out, I knew from the get-go, from the time it was announced, that I was going to be in on it. And this one is really living up to expectations. So far, there are 2 issues of this comic that have been released. Another 3rd issue coming out later this month. And to give you an idea of the story that we're looking at here, of course, I don't know yet how it's going to unfold, but we open with a news reporter and a city councilman who's got a guilty conscience, and they're meeting at an all-night diner called the Green Eye at 2 o'clock in the morning. What better way to start your detective crime story than that? Here's where it goes from there. A group of gangsters come in, led by Flat Top, one of those great Dick Tracy villains. They come in with Tommy guns and they start mowing down everybody in the diner. Dick Tracy's going to be assigned to the case, and he's going to be assisted in working on this case, not by official assignment by any means, but by circumstances, by the daughter of that recently deceased city councilman, who also happens to be a news reporter, and you'll recognize this name if you know that movie or the Dick Tracy lore, Tess Trueheart. Now, at this point, Tess Trueheart is not Dick Tracy's girlfriend. They are just meeting for the first time at this point in their history. Through a bit of snooping around in her father's office that Tess Trueheart does, it puts her and Dick Tracy onto a lead that there's a gangster named Mumbles, and of course you may remember from the movie he was played by Dustin Hoffman, that they're not familiar with, but they seem to know he has something to do with the crime. Well, they go to arrest Mumbles, and Flat Top appears again out of the back seat of a car, and he tries to gun them all down out in the street in one of the most brazen ways. Of course, Dick Tracy manages to save the day, and he and Tess Trueheart and Mumbles make their escape. Mumbles is taken off to jail, and poor Flat Top has to go back and report to his own boss, the man who's calling all the shots for his side of this gang war that's going to break out in town. None other than Big Boy Caprice, who, I'm sorry I keep referencing back to the movie, but I'm going to keep doing it. This character was played by Al Pacino in that movie. And so Big Boy is kind of revealed on the last page of issue 1, and he's giving an order that this Dick Tracy can't be allowed to get in the way of whatever their plans are. Dick Tracy has to be killed. Moving into issue number 2, we start now with Pat Patton, one who readers or people familiar with the Dick Tracy property may be aware usually ends up being an ally of Dick Tracy or one of the side police detectives. At this point, he is a recently returned World War II veteran, and he's going down to the docks. And you always know there's trouble on the docks. But he's going down there because he wants to find out some information about his brother, who is either missing or dead. We don't know exactly what the story is. But as he goes down there, he encounters 2 more of those great Dick Tracy villains, Itchy and Pruneface. Well, as it turns out, Pat Patton is also an old war buddy of Dick Tracy, and he ends up connecting with Tracy and with Tess Trueheart over the course of this issue, and so it looks like we're going to have a 3-person investigative team that's working together. Dick Tracy and 2 civilians, which is kind of great. As further events unfold involving Mumbles and Flat Top over the course of the issue, we're going to end up learning that there's another big gangster behind some of the funny business that's going on down at the docks, and this is going to be none other than Lips Manless. You may remember this character being played by Paul Sorvino. And so where we left off at the end of issue 2 is we've got kind of a 3-way war that's going to take place. We've got Team Tracy with Dick Tracy, Tess Trueheart, and Pat Patton on one side. We've got Team Big Boy with Big Boy and Flat Top, and as it's going to turn out, at least some of the corrupt police force. And then also Team Lips. Lips Manless, Itchy, Pruneface, Shoulders. We know Mumbles was associated with that gang. Who knows who else will be introduced from some of those classic characters or where we'll go from here. But it looks like Guns are going to be pointed in all directions, and this is going to be a whole lot of fun. I cannot wait to continue with this series. The second book I wanted to highlight today from my pull list, another Mad Cave book, another one that's also 2 issues deep into its run, called Sanction. The credits on this book are it's written by Ray Fawkes, artist Antonio Fuso, colors by Emilio Lecce, letters by Dave Sharpe, and as I mentioned earlier, the main cover for issue number 1 is done by Dan Panosian, and it is cool looking. So this comic is set in Leningrad, Soviet Union, 1987, so modern-day St. Petersburg, Russia. On the morning of New Year's Day, a body of a woman who's presumed to be a prostitute is found sitting on the ice on the sidewalk. This case is going to be assigned to a young and hungry police detective named Boris Dmitrovich. Now, this didn't start out as his case. It was handed off to him by a more senior detective who's going to be an important character as well, a detective by the name of Pavel Smirnov. He just wants Dmitrovich to close this case and be done with it. And we get this sense from right when we first meet him, really, as a reader anyway, that we can't trust Detective Smirnov. It could be that he's just a lazy drunk, because he appears to be both lazy and drunk at most points when we see him in this comic. It could be that he's corrupt and trying to cover something up. And I think as we move more into the comic and even into issue 2, you start to get the idea that maybe what he's doing really is kind of turning a blind eye to crime as a means of protecting a system where high closed case rates, even if those cases aren't truly solved and if the statistics aren't even true, contribute to the official Soviet line that, quote, Leningrad is paradise, unquote. But our detective Dmitrovich isn't the kind of person who's just going to go along with sloppy police work and letting a murderer go free. He's the kind of person who has to get to the bottom of this. And he's got a feeling about this case from the moment he first sees it. It reminds him of a case that he'd worked on 2 years earlier, another one that Detective Smirnov had encouraged him just to close up and put away. And from just a few glimpses, really 1 or 2 pages that we get that are sort of out of context from the rest of the book early on in issue 2, we've got reason to believe that there might be a serial killer. And a lot of issue 2 goes to reinforce the idea that it is imperative to maintain this notion that Leningrad is paradise, even if that means burying the truth. And we realize that these are the kinds of conditions that can allow a serial killer to operate undetected for years. But our detective Dmitrovich is going back into the old case files at least as much as he can get into them, and he's going to be searching for the truth. I don't know how many issues this series is supposed to run. I would guess it's something like 5, but I don't know. I'm going to be looking at every single one of them no matter what. So guys, those are just a couple of books that I'm looking at right now. If those stories sound interesting to you, go by your local comic book shop or check them out on Global Comics. Either way, thanks for being here and listening, and keep reading those comics.